I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mack Payne.
This is Mack Payne here with episode 1743 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the CIA, everybody's favorite spy organization. Well, not everybody's favorite. Right now, in the current political situation going on in Washington in May of 2020, the CIA is in a little bit of hot water because some people are claiming they were doing things they shouldn't have been doing, especially when you mention the name General Flynn. Seems like that's nothing new with the CIA. There have been claims that they have been stepping off the straight and narrow path ever since they were formed up back in the 40s. A while back, I read a very interesting book that is on the recommended reading list for this podcast. The name of it was The Road Not Taken. It was written by Max Boot. The subtitle was Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam. It's a wonderful book. If you have not read it, I highly encourage you to take a look at it. I'll guarantee you'll become a fan of Edward Lansdale after you read it. In this episode, I will continue looking at the CIA. This time, I'm going to tell you about a CIA officer by the name of Ralph W. McGehee. He recently passed away at the age of 92. They say he died of coronavirus. I have always been skeptical of coronavirus death statistics ever since I heard that when someone dies of the coronavirus, the local facility or county or whatever, they get money from the federal government. I would not be surprised if there are some people out there who claim someone died from coronavirus when maybe they didn't. Or maybe they were in the same building where someone had it. So they said, hey, they died from coronavirus. Mr. McGehee was 92 years old. He might have just died from natural causes. Coronavirus is natural, from what I understand. The reason I'm talking about him is he wrote a very interesting book titled Deadly Deceits, which is also on the recommended reading list from this podcast. I highly recommend you get a copy of it and read it. It's sort of disturbing when you see what our government is doing behind the curtain. That was brought out in the Road Not Taken book, talking about all the shenanigans Edward Lansdale was getting into. Edward Lansdale single-handedly started up the country of the Philippines and South Vietnam. Unfortunately, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, did not take Lansdale's advice. He just could not deal with someone so unorthodox as Edward Lansdale. Edward Lansdale was in Vietnam in the early days. He was there right after the French were defeated at Bien Dien Phu, and the two countries of Vietnam were formed. He was instrumental in setting up South Vietnam and its government. Ralph McGehee was there about the same time Lansdale was there. Ralph was not mentioned in the Road Not Taken book, but after reading the story I'm going to share with you, I know the two of them were nearby working on the situation there in Vietnam. I'm going to share a story with you about Mr. McGehee that was titled Ralph McGehee, CIA officer who became an agency critic, dies at 92 of coronavirus. This story was written by Harrison Smith of the Washington Post, and it appeared on the Boston Globe website. It talks about an individual who was very patriotic. He wanted to do something to fight communism, and he took the path of becoming a member of the CIA. after a while he became disillusioned at what he saw was going on in Vietnam. Just one of many. I'm going to share his story with you just so you know what's going on behind the scenes up in D.C. Again, the story is titled, Ralph McGehee, CIA officer who became an agency critic, dies at 92 of coronavirus. Dateline, Washington, D.C. Ralph W. McGehee, who joined the CIA out of college as a gung-ho Cold Warrior, became disillusioned during the Vietnam War and emerged as a prominent critic of the agency after publishing the memoir Deadly Deceits. He died on May the 2nd at an assisted living facility in Falmouth, Maine. He was 92. He was probably a good friend of Daniel Ellsberg. For your information, Daniel Ellsberg was one of Edward Lansdale's assistants over in Vietnam. On a side here, Ellsberg was apparently a real ladies' man. He got into trouble over in Vietnam when he began dating a Sicilian mafia boss's girlfriend. Lansdale had to step in and save his life because the Sicilian mafia guy was going to do in Ellsberg because he was messing with his girlfriend. But Lansdale saved him, and the paramour was therefore able to live another day and go on to leak the Pentagon Papers to the Washington Post. Let's get back to Ralph McGehee's story. His son, Dan McGehee, said the cause was COVID-19, the disease caused by the novel coronavirus. Raised during the Depression and World War II, Mr. McGehee joined the CIA in 1952 to fight communism and save the world for democracy. A star football player in college, he had played on 3 national championship teams at Notre Dame, no less, and excelled during exercises at the farm, which is the agency's clandestine training center at Camp Peary in Virginia. He went to work as a case officer and counterrevolutionary operator in the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam, where he served as the tip of the spear of American foreign policy and by the late 1960s was increasingly racked with doubts about his mission. In Mr. McGehee's telling, the CIA suppressed his assessments about widespread communist support in northeast Thailand, where he found that the Communist Party was building a mass-based revolutionary movement, rather than terrorizing the population into submission. He saw something similar in Vietnam, where a broad swath of society seemed to be rebelling against years of occupation and oppression. Mr. McGehee came to believe that the agency was intentionally distorting intelligence to support the White House's political goals, ginning up support for the Vietnam War, even as its outlook worsened. Seated in his Saigon apartment in 1969, he considered hanging a banner from his window that read, "The CIA lies," and then shooting himself, according to a New York Times report that chronicled the disintegration of his small corner of the American dream. Vietnam broke him, as it did so many millions of people, said former Times reporter Tim Weiner, author of the CIA history Legacy of Ashes. He had spent half of his life working for the American cause, and when Saigon fell, his work went up in smoke. As news reports and congressional investigations exposed CIA assassination plots and domestic spying programs, Mr. McGehee grew restless and bitter, later recalling years filled with anger, bitterness, self-doubts, mistrust, disbelief, disgust, and struggle. In 1977, after 25 years with the CIA, he volunteered for a new early retirement program. Somewhat to his surprise, he left with the Career Intelligence Medal awarded by William Wells, the Deputy Director for Operations. Mr. McGehee said he accepted it in part to give my children an occasion to be proud of their father, adding in his memoir that the medal citation offered further confirmation that the CIA's intelligence was flawed. It recognized his excellent work in Malaysia. a country which I had never even visited. Working out of his house in the Washington suburb of Herndon, Virginia, he pored over histories of the Vietnam War to write Deadly Deceits, published in 1983, which chronicled his years in the CIA and concluded with a scathing condemnation of the agency as a whole. Mr. McGehee wrote, "The CIA is not now, nor has it ever been, a central intelligence agency. It is the covert action arm of the President's foreign policy advisors. In that capacity, it overthrows or supports foreign governments while reporting intelligence justifying their activities. Disinformation is a large part of its covert action responsibility, and the American people are the primary target audience of its lies." In an interview Tuesday, Weiner called Deadly Deceits a cold, hard look at the agency's failure in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, his own failures among them. He added that although Mr. McGehee was right to argue that the CIA had beggared the gathering and analysis of information in favor of covert action and coups, the agency was not strictly targeting the American people. When the CIA went wrong in those days, he said it was often deceiving itself. Like all current or former CIA officers, Mr. McGehee was required to submit his manuscript to the agency's Publication Review Board, which checks for classified information. It initially censored 397 sections of the book, ranging from a single word to several pages, spurring a 2-year battle over publication. Mr. McGehee credited its successful release to help from an American Civil Liberties Union lawyer and a 1982 article from the Washington Post, which reported that agency censors were apparently trying to reclassify information that had circulated for years. The agency made no bones about it. They just weren't going to let me write my book, Mr. McGehee told a radio interviewer after it was published. If any information is embarrassing, shows them doing immoral things, they'll classify it. While researching Deadly Deceits, Mr. McGehee began developing CIA Base, an online archive of news reports, congressional testimony, and other materials that the investigative journalist Jeff Stein called an indispensable source for those of us reporting on intelligence activities. In interviews and lectures, Mr. McGehee called for the CIA to be dismantled and said that the agency had harassed him by posting officers outside his home. After reading about the CIA, I have to say, I agree with what Mr. McGehee said. The CIA should be done away with. Start off with something new. Mr. McGehee threw himself into writing his book, working away at a manual typewriter. He was angry, his son Dan said, and you could just hear him typing away. Wham, wham. He was just pounding the typewriter. It changed him, Dan added by phone. It changed his personality. In our memorial service, each of my siblings talked about how here was this gruff man we grew up with who turned into this amazing grandfather who was sweet, caring, and attentive. I'm sure that writing the book was therapeutic. Mr. McGee's wife of 63 years, the former Norma Galbraith, died in 2012. Survivors include 4 children. Dan McGehee, also known as Keenan Dakota of Louisa, Virginia. Jan Marteski of Youngsville, Nevada. Scott McGehee of Kailua, Hawaii. And Peggy McGehee Horton of Falmouth, Maine. 10 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. That's the story of Ralph W. McGehee, a CIA officer who came in out of the cold and shined the light on the agency's shortcomings. After reading about him and Edward Lansdale, I really do think the CIA should be dismantled. Just do away with it. It's been involved in numerous other political shenanigans, including the Watergate era, including the Russia investigation. So it's time to get rid of it. Thank you, Ralph McGehee, for your service to your country, and thank you for writing that book, Deadly Deceits, so all of us can know what's going on with the CIA. And maybe we really should consider getting rid of it. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mack Payne here, closing out episode 1743 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these programs. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?